Hey, friends, we're talking about Judges today as we're reading through the Bible in a year. Judges is a challenging book in a sense, interpretively. And I think there's some things that we need to process here as we read it. It's that one of the things is that not everything that people do, not everything that that God is using do is good things, is good ideas, and some of that's not necessarily evident in the stories if you don't think through them a little bit more deeply. It's easy when somebody does something and then that action is condemned or spoken against in a narrative. It's harder when it's not the case. But what we need to know, particularly as we move into these later chapters in the book of Judges, is this idea that, and it's the concluding line of the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. So what we see, I think, here in the book of Judges is that oftentimes even the good characters, so we can think of like Samson, for example. I'm not going to actually talk a lot about Samson today, and I didn't do that in our discussions really at all. But you see there somebody who's got a kind of it's complicated kind of story. So we're used to, maybe as we think about Bible stories, characters that are good and characters that are bad, and they fall into one or the other. And most of the time, that's not the case. Even with characters who are consistently mostly good, think of like a Moses, for example. There's still some substantial issues. We'll see that with somebody like David. That's upcoming as well. So in this time period, there's some messed up things that are going on, and if we're not careful, we're gonna miss some of that. And some things are interpretive questions that are interesting to think about. Let me just mention one thing here along the way, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time here with Jephthah. He's in Judges chapter 11, and then from 10 into 11 and 12. And I think is mostly a good character. But there's this thing that troubles us, and I think it should as readers of the Bible in a way. So in chapter 11, verse 30, Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now that might seem fine, well, and good, with the assumption, I think, as Jephthah thought, that it was going to be an animal that came out first. And this is an interesting thing as we think about the Christmas story, that in the ancient world, oftentimes the animals would live within the house. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of how that architecture worked. So it seems like Jephthah's idea is that, whichever one of the animals comes out first, I will give as a burnt offering if the Lord gives him victory. Now, as we see in the story, what came out of his house first was his daughter, which is, of course, a tragic. And there's some different, ways that what happened to her has been interpreted, but I think the idea here is a couple things. One thing we see is that how important oaths were. If you made an oath before the Lord, you were obligated to keep it, even if it had dire consequences. That was their understanding. And so Jesus, as the master teacher, is smart enough to know and to teach don't take oaths. Like, there's no reason you have to take an oath. Don't do it. And people would take oaths that they didn't need to take. God didn't tell Jephthah to do this. He decided to do it, and it wasn't poorly motivated, but it was thoroughly unwise for him to do this. He didn't think it through, apparently, or the possibility that it could be his daughter that came out of the house first when he gave this oath. And if God was going to give him the victory, he was going to give him the victory. God doesn't need to play these games with this, God, if you do this, then I'll do that kind of thing. So I think he's well-intentioned, but part of the reality, I think, in this time period is that it's so broken that even the good guys, even the well-intentioned people, make some tragic errors in these kind of things. And so, but anyway, hopefully that gives you some things at least to think about with that story of Jephthah. Samson's story is, of course, a great, interesting story as well. But I'm just not. I could spend a whole, like I did yesterday with Gideon. I could do a whole thing with Samson. But I think Samson, although his story, like anything else in Scripture, provides some interpretive challenges for us, I think it's maybe not the hardest one to kind of deal with. So let me talk some about Judges chapters 17 and 18. Somebody asked me about these and then on. So let me see if I can kind of fairly quickly survey some of what's going on here, because again, I don't know, it might be easy to kind of get lost in some of this and miss what I think is the point. And again, whatever I'm suggesting, you can evaluate for yourself. I'm not kind of trying to necessarily present this here as authoritative interpretation on the book of Judges, but I'm kind of sending the ball back into your court with some ideas to see if, does this make sense of the Scripture for you to wrestle with? And maybe, again, you'll see things that I won't see, or some things maybe more or less satisfying as ways of understanding to you versus me, etc. But that's why we do Bible study together as we seek to understand what it is that's going on here. So Micah, of course, is not. There's a book of the Bible named Micah much later on, very, very different time period later in the story. This is a different Micah from the prophet Micah, who has his own book, if you will, one of the 12 minor prophets, we call him. Of course, the names, many people had the same names in the ancient world, so that's not necessarily a huge surprise. So introduced to him in chapter 17. This is the thing with the money, and I can talk too much about that. But he uses this money that he has to make an idol, which, of course, as we know, and guys, come into the book of Judges. It's so valuable to have the reading that we've done beforehand. This is why we have to. Here's a big Bible study principle, and it's more, I don't know, easy to do this, but we have more resources as time goes by, that you want to ask yourself, where in the story are we? What do we already know? What should these people know? What have they forgotten, right? We've done the Torah. We've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. We have this background. They should have had this background. They should know these things, but they're not living them out oftentimes. And so, but again, we have to realize this. It's not going to be, not every bit of detail of what should be known is going to be brought back up throughout the narrative. Now it's assumed that there's certain things that we know about God's expectation, particularly crystal clear. There's not a doubt about idolatry. The Ten Commandments, right? There's no other gods before me. You don't make any images. No idols. No matter what your intention, you just don't do it. This is, the Exodus, the Ten Commandments, the law, foundation. And so when we see how these things are, and to the extent that they're part of the story and who it is that participates in this, we see just how dark the book of Judges is. We see just how far God's people are away from his will for them. Again, not in little details. In the biggest of things, they're totally wrong. That needs to be crystal clear. But maybe it's not. Just if you're just reading the narrative without having this big picture. We have to have the big picture. And guys, that's why I'm just focusing on the same things again and again and again and again. Because if we're only in details and we don't see the big picture, we're going to miss it. We're not going to read scripture well if we don't understand what it is that God has already revealed, what it is that they need to know. We're not going to be good readers of the Bible. That's why this through the Bible in a year, it's not about the year, but through the Bible thing, so that we can have this big picture. It's really valuable and really important. So all that to say, now we're back to the time when somebody in Israel thought, hey, I got some money, making an idol would be a great idea. We talked about idols with Gideon and stuff yesterday, some as well. So Micah and his mother, in verse 4, chapter 17, they take the silver and 200 shekels of it and gave it to a silversmith who used it to make an idol. And it was put in Micah's house. Now, this man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod. We saw that with, I'm not going to get to the ephod. And some household gods, and installed one of his sons as his priest. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit, right? Big clue. That's a repeated thing, particularly in this last larger section of Judges. But the fact that that's right there, bing, big clue. What he's doing here is not a good idea. It's a terrible idea. This is terrible. But if you don't know, you don't know. So there's your clue that you're supposed to know this. So Micah has the shrine. He's doing his own little cultic thing, his own little mini deal here with these idols. He's got his own priest. This is not the priesthood that God set up. He said, hey, I'm going to have a priest. Like one of my kids, a priest. Like everyone did what seemed good in their own eyes. Like this is a terrible idea. We don't just get to make up our own religious stuff. I mean, give me a break, Micah. This is nutso, but it was the norm. Right? Because this is not a good time, period, for them. So, all right, the story continues, and it continues to get worse. But again, maybe it doesn't seem that way if you don't know. Verse 7, a young Levite. Now, who are the Levites? Do you remember? Should be hopefully evident by now, but the Levites are those who are responsible for the tabernacle. Some of the Levites are priests. Some take care of the transportation and the care of the tabernacle as it moves around. There are different places, but they're people who should know. They, of all people, should know better. They're the closest to taking care of God's presence among them, among the people. So a Levite, everybody ought to know better. A Levite ought to certainly know better. But again, example of how just even these people just don't get it. It's such a bad time. And that needs to be clear again, even though it might not be clear if you're not tracking forward the story that we already have. So he is looking for a place to stay. On his way, he came to Micah's house in the hill country. Micah asked him, where are you from? I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. He said, I'm looking for a place to stay. Then Micah said, so Micah obviously, or I think obviously, knows who the Levites are, what they're supposed to be. Oh, this guy would be a great candidate to be my little kind of pet priest here and take care of this. So live with me, Micah says to him, verse 10, chapter 17, and be my father and priest, and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food. So what should his response to be? What are you, nuts, Micah? You can't have idols. Like, we worship the one true God. Like, his tabernacle is there. Like, this is nuts. That's not what he says. he agrees to it. Oh, great deal. I get paid. I get like, oh my goodness. This is terrible. All right. We can move on because I have more I want to talk about. And then, so verse 13, Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since this Levite has become my priest." So, here's a good question. Does Micah himself know better? Or is it such a situation where God's instruction, who God is and how to properly honor him, has just been not taught at all? Or so twisted that he thinks this way. In any case, it's terrible. The situation is it's a mess. So in chapter 18, this is really interesting in a terrible way again. So the Danites, the tribe of Dan, when whoever comes to Israel with me next year, we will go to Tel Dan, and we'll see. And we talk mainly about what happens with after Solomon's death with Jeroboam and Rehoboam in the golden calf, or the calf that they make as an idol then. But this is the backstory for that, even back here. So the tribe couldn't settle in the land that God gave them, and so they went up and tried to find somewhere else that's up in the north, and they encounter they enter into the story of this guy Micah and the Levite priest, who I don't think we have his name, the young Levite. So they inquire of him, "Please inquire of this young Levite to learn whether our journey will be successful." And the priest, corrupt priest, answers them, "Go in peace. Your journey has the Lord's approval." And I'm like, how does he know? How does he know that the journey has the Lord's approval? I mean, this is just... All right. What do I want to say here? So they come and they steal they talk the Levite and into taking away these gods, these idols with him, and they do that. This Levite's not even loyal to this guy Micah. He goes with them, and Micah's, of course, agitated. He goes after them, but there's too many of them. What are they gonna do, right? Like in verse 24 of chapter 18, Micah says, "You took the gods I made and my priest and took them away. What else do I have?" I mean, it's messed up, right? So the end of chapter 18, verse 31. So that now they're up in this town. We call it Tel Dan now, but Laish is what it was before. But they take it over, and it becomes Dan, up in the north of Israel. And it says in verse 31, "They continued to use the idol Micah had made all the time that the house of God, the tabernacle, right, was in Shiloh." It's there for a while before it ultimately comes to rest in Jerusalem, and then the temple gets made sort of after that. So really interesting / terrible story. Chapter 19, another really, really terrible story. And again, we're reminded at the beginning, in those days, Israel had no king. The idea being there's no stable leadership. There's no godly leadership. Everybody just does whatever they think is a good idea. And that is terrible. It's a terrible idea. So there's this whole substantial narrative in chapter 19 with this Levite, his concubine, who goes back to her father's house, and then he goes to get her, and then he stays for a while, and then they head back, and they're trying to get back to what they feel like is going to be a safe place because it's amongst Israelites, not other people. The Jebusites, they're not Israelites, right? And so he doesn't want to go there. He wants to go somewhere that's going to be safe because it's God's people. So we need to see that in the narrative in chapter 19, right? As they travel along, like I would just reference verse 11. So in verse 12, the master replied to his servant, this Levite, "No, we won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. Let's go to Gibeah." And he said, let's try to reach there. Like they're trying to get to a safe place where they know they'll be treated well because of their people, and then it's God's people, right? So they go there. It takes them a little bit, but they're invited into someone's house there as they're approaching Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so Benjamin's going to become important here in the remaining bit of the book of Judges. And feel free to leave comments, thoughts, or questions, guys, too, as well. I don't know. I feel like I have this like weight of all these things I want to talk about, but I don't want to talk forever for your sake or mine either. But hopefully this is helpful to get some context here to some of what's going on. Let me skip forward to verse 22, chapter 19. Well, they were enjoying themselves, so they're in the house of this man who welcomed them in, the Levite, the servant, his concubine, etc. While they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so that we can have sex with him." What does this remind you of? This reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah, the way that this kind of the hospitality and the demand of this, and it's just I think. But here's the point. So if we look back to think about Sodom and Gomorrah and bring judgment on them, this is now this tribe of Benjamin. These are Israelites. These are the people that God has saved and given a way of life, and they're acting just as bad as people who have nothing to do with God. So this is really bad, right? And this is kind of how it goes. And I'm not going to get into details here. This is really rated beyond R. It's terrible as far as what these people do to this woman. They rape her. They abuse her. Ultimately, she dies as a result of that. So this man, her husband, concubine versus wife is a little bit different. We're not going to get into the nuance of that. He's called her husband. And again, this is really violent. I don't know if violent's the word. She's already dead. That's violent. But he cuts her into 12 pieces. First of all, we're not necessarily told that this is a good idea. We need to be careful here. Here's just a biblical interpretation principle to keep in mind. What people do don't necessarily assume it's a good idea or an idea that God says 2 thumbs up to. Remember, over this whole book, this is a period where everybody does what's right in their own eyes. So some things could be good at times, could be just unwise at times, could be terrible at times. We could probably put different things into those different categories throughout the book of Judges, but we're not told in each moment necessarily what's a good idea, what's a bad idea. Sometimes we have to either assume that given other information that we have in Scripture. Sometimes we're told things with regard to God, but like in this case, we're not told that God told him to do this. We're just told he did it. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them to every. This sounds like a serial killer thing, right? In a way, but what's he doing? What's the point here? We're not told directly, but what happens, gives us it gives us enough of the idea. I think, here's my understanding. I think he's trying to communicate to the whole of Israel how atrocious this is, how terrible that these are people who are these Benjaminites, who are fellow Israelites, are just allowed to do this without repercussion. And so the people respond by getting together anyway. So that's what happens, the outcome. And again, we could spend a lot of time thinking about the possibilities of a lot of these things. But in chapter 20, they gather together, and the Israelites said, at the end of verse 3, tell us how this awful thing happened. Okay. So basically what happens is that all of the other tribes get together and basically go up against Benjamin. This is a civil war. Again, when it's a civil war, it's a dark thing. It's not a good thing when a nation, when a people is turned in on itself. So yeah, that's there. I'm gonna yeah, and then in chapter 21, again, even the ones who maybe we think are in the right in this thing, again, we see another example of this thing about oaths. So the other tribes take an oath that they're not going to give any of their daughters, any other women, to men in the tribe of Benjamin to be wives, as part of this kind of ongoing sort of deal. So then they have this problem. They make this oath. And guys, so here's a lesson from Jesus, the master. Don't make oaths. It's a bad idea. So they make an oath and like, oh, well, how are these guys? Like, there's these 12 tribes. There's got to be these 12 tribes. The tribe of Benjamin has to continue to exist in part of this plan here. But how's that going to work if these guys don't have any wives? How can they have kids to continue on the tribe? And so they have this, really terrible idea. In a sense, it works, and that there's this gathering that happens at Shiloh where everybody comes together, and they tell these Benjamin guys, when the girls are out there dancing, go and take one as a wife and bring her home with you. We're like, how does that work? Why is that a good idea? Well, it's not a good idea, but they put themselves in this impossible situation because of a stupid oath. And again, they felt very, very strongly, and for God-given reason about how important oaths are. This is why we also, again, a lot of what we've seen about oaths, about how they could be. All right, I'm not going to go back there. Just too much. So yeah, so again, we can look at this, and people will look at things in here. People that are either wrestling with it as people of faith, like maybe some of us at times, or others who are critics of the Bible, and they'll say, look in the Bible, they had this idea that you just go and grab a woman you want to be your wife. Well, if you don't understand the context, the genre, the overarching statements that are made on here, is that this is a time when people aren't following God. They're not wise. They're not godly for the most part, right? There's a few people that stick out in the midst of it that God uses. Some of them are really messed up. Some of them aren't really at all, like a Deborah. Some of them are in the middle and have some serious problems, like a Samson. But in any case, so hopefully that helps you make some sense of some of the difficulty in these stories. But you have to have this concept in mind of what the book of Judges. So what's the book of Judges, intended, as we leave it now, what's the book of Judges intended to leave us with? This is not a good time. There's no king. So we're looking forward now. We're going to have a little bit of a pause for the book of Ruth, which takes place during this period in time. But ultimately now we're looking forward to Samuel, who kind of becomes the bridge here between judges and kings in Israel. But this book of Judges wants us to kind of pull our attention forward and to realize something's not good here. Something's got to be different. So what's that going to be. So I think here's kind of a lesson, like don't just treat the Bible as a collection of true statements that you can just pull out in and of themselves and just say, here it is, it's in the Bible, it's good. Well, no, the whole point of it sometimes is that it's not good. And that's what the Bible is trying to communicate to you. But if you just pull out verses, or if you just tune in without having a big picture context of Scripture, you're going to be off in your interpretation of it, and it's going to lead into some difficult places. But when you understand what's going on here and the context within the section, the book, and the big picture of the whole biblical story, it's still challenging, but we're less likely to go off in certain areas in problematic ways. So hopefully that's helpful. Again, leave your thoughts, comments, questions. I'd be glad to continue to talk with you. We're on to Ruth. Probably Monday for me. You won't see me tomorrow on Saturday. Monday, I'll catch us up into Ruth, and we'll talk some about that. So I'll see you guys later.